child? Perhaps. But whether my very wise grandfather knew it or not, he was preparing me to face both living and dying, and his preparation was about to help me as I faced death a few months later. It was during the winter of my almost 4th year when I became very ill. Grandma had nursed me with every homemade remedy she could, and she and Grandpa had alternated between holding my weak, feverish, and painfully coughing body in their arms in front of the open oven door. I was totally miserable. I refused to eat or drink. I only wanted to sleep. One day a man came to the house. This was the doctor who examined me while Grandma held me on her lap. I remember he spoke in hushed tones to my grandparents. "I'm afraid it's probably pneumonia. She'll have to be admitted to the hospital as soon as possible. I'll meet you there." I felt a chill go through me. I had no idea what he was talking about, but being an extremely sensitive child, I recoiled from the dark and solemn tone in which he spoke. Soon after, my snowsuit was put on, and I was rewrapped in a quilt and carried out to the car to sit on Grandma's lap for the short ride to the hospital. At the hospital, Grandpa carried me up to a desk where a woman in white directed us to a room where the same doctor again examined me. I remember Grandma began crying and left. The doctor said, "She'll have to be put in a corridor bed because there are no rooms available." There was no memory until I woke up in a bed with a plastic tent around it. This, of course, was the oxygen tent that would help me breathe. I could hear hushed voices and the rattle of carts passing by, but the sounds seemed as if they were coming from a very great distance. The one thing that pierced my senses was the horrible antiseptic smell that seemed to be everywhere. At this point, my memory of home became vague and distorted as my weak and sick self fought to survive. I was in and out of consciousness, waking only sporadically, too tired to care. The sleeps I went into were deep, and I welcomed the darkness they offered. Time had no meaning, so I do not recall exactly when it was that some unknown sensation awakened me from one of my slumbers. Suddenly, my senses were accosted by the sound of a child's voice, urgently calling my name. The voice seemed to be coming from within my own head and also from all around bed. There was no way to ignore it. Marilou, get up and come play with me. It's Emmy, come on." I believe I opened my eyes to tiny slits, and there before me was a beautiful blonde-haired girl of about 5 or 6. She had twinkling blue eyes and a smile that was so engaging. She wore a pale blue silky dress that was high-necked and lacy, and her person just shone with joy. Her perkiness made me feel even worse. She was nothing if not insistent. "Come on, hurry up. We're all here waiting for you. Look." The scene shifted, and I could see past her to a sunlit meadow where children of all sizes, shapes, and colors were playing games of tag, ring around the rosy, or chase. They all seemed to be between the ages of about 3 to 10 and were very happy and healthy looking. I felt myself drift into the meadow. I stood very still while the children ran and played around me, accepting my presence easily. I could smell the sweet grass, feel it brush against my bare legs, feel the sun's warmth on my head. It was so peaceful and beautiful. One thing I noticed was that all the children were making noise, laughing and shrieking with joy, but not one mouth was open. All were communicating with their minds, and I found I could easily listen in. Oh, how I longed to join them, but the tiredness was pulling me down into its velvety embrace. Then, too, something whispered in my mind. It would be a very bad idea to go with Emmy and join her and the sunlit meadow. She held out her hand to me. "Marilou, come on, take my hand. You'll like it here. I know you will." Quickly, an image of my grandparents rose up in my mind, and I somehow knew that if I took Emmy's hand, I might never see my dear grandma and grandpa again, or my beloved home. I don't remember how I left the meadow, but I soon realized I was back in my hospital bed. It took all my strength, but I believe I managed to push my hands under my back so that I wouldn't be tempted to take Emmy's hand. As soon as I did this, Emmy seemed to fade, and the joyful shouts of the children in that other place became distant echoes. The experience with Emmy had been very tiring, and I wanted to go back to sleep, but something outside the tent commanded my attention. A light was forming that was much brighter than the lights in the ceiling of the corridor I was in. This light pulsated with love and warmth and protection. Oddly, it didn't hurt my eyes to look at it. As I watched, it formed into a sort of an oblong shape and drifted up into the corner of the hallway ceiling and stayed there, with an incredible feeling of love and total joy, and I knew that as long as it was there, I was safe. I fell asleep in the peace and presence of the light. However, Emmy was not going to give up so easy, and she returned on at least 3 other occasions and seemed desperate for me to take her hand and join hers. Each time she came, the light moved from the corner of the ceiling and illuminated the area around my bed, and Emmy would fade away. One day, the being of light took on a glowing human form, leaned through the tent, and touched me gently on the forehead. It whispered in my mind that it was time for me to wake up. I remember waking up instantly and seeing things with greater clarity than I had in many days. As a child, I had no idea how long I had been ill and communing with Emmy and the being of light, but it felt like forever. I was very weak and extremely hungry and thirsty, and shaking with the effort, I managed to pull myself to a sitting position and began to hit against the tent cover. A nurse came running and opened the tent flap, and seeing me setting up, ran off and came back a few minutes later with the doctor. I was examined and shortly after moved into a semi-private room. Grandpa came by later that day to visit me. He pushed down the bar of the crib and gathered me in his arms and fell asleep. Next day, he brought me my teddy bear from home, and the sweet scent of it helped me heal. I believe I stayed in the hospital for at least a week, enduring endless penicillin shots and eating Jell-O and drinking orange juice for more days than I cared to remember. Strength returned. I did wonder what happened to Emmy and the beautiful light being, not knowing, of course, that I had just survived my experience in my young soul, allowing me communication with the other side on the future. I never told anyone about my experiences. He didn't know until shortly before he died, shared his own near-death experience with me. The day Grandpa carried me out of the hospital and down several corridors, I looked up in all the corners we passed. The light was not there anymore. I returned to the sweet embrace of my home and my grandparents' love, and life went on, one day blending joyfully. The years turned over, and I knew some tough times, but nothing I couldn't handle. But then the next challenge to my happiness made itself known when I was about 9. This new threat was in the form of the chronic disease, asthma. Anyone who has ever suffered from this ailment knows the horrible sensation of being unable to breathe and feeling as if death and suffocation are only moments away. Nowadays, medicine has supposedly advanced to the use of various medications and inhalers that will bring some relief. Back when I was afflicted with either a trip to the hospital for a shot or taking a nasty tasting red medicine that, while it seemed to stop the attack, knocked me out for hours. Not a proponent of medication then or now, I usually opted to tough it out and suffer the attack, which usually lasted about 3 days. Eventually from exhaustion, and awaken feeling shaky, but okay. There were times when I would stop breathing, and thankfully Grandpa was nearby. He hit me on the back, and this seemed to restore my equilibrium. Then during the summer of my 16th year, one of the attacks was fiercer than any of the others. At this point in time, I was still sleeping in my grandparents' room on a sofa. Grandpa had built me a slanted backrest with a big pillow on it so that I could sleep sitting up, which made it easier to breathe. It was a warm and muggy summer night, and the air hung heavy in the little house. Through the open bedroom door, I could hear my grandparents in the kitchen getting ready for bed and speaking in hushed tones. I must say that up to this point, I had prayed fiercely to be cured of this dis-ease. It had affected me on every level, and for years I had been totally unable to truly enjoy being a child. I yearned to be able to experience life as I saw my friends doing. Thus far, my prayers had gone unanswered. This night would bring a miracle. I felt myself stop breathing. Unable to get out of bed or cry out for Grandpa to help me, I fell back against the pillow. The icy brush of death, so familiar from my time in the hospital, hovered near, and while I did not fear it, I did not welcome it. My soul self rose easily up out of my head, and I was able to body slump sideways on the pillow. I had a brief moment of feeling sorry for myself, looking so vulnerable, but then the pull to leave beckoned strongly. In my lighter-than-air soul body, I went up through the ceiling and then through the roof of the house, and again instantly found myself in the sunlit meadow. Before me stretched an endless field, waving gently and sang. Hundreds of children of all ages and nationalities played around me. There was no Emmy, but she could have been there. Once more, there was the sound of many conversations, shrieks of joy and laughter, but not one mouth moved on any of those present. Mind talk was going on, and I began to listen. But then something began to pull me back to my bed. In the blink of an eye, I found my soul self drifting down through the treetops, through the roof and the ceiling of the bedroom. I paused and floated above my body and looked at it. It was still slumped sideways, and at first it would break their hearts. They had already lost all 3 of their children. They would not recover from losing me. I quickly slid into my body through the head. At the moment, a commanding male voice, very insistent, echoed in my mind. I opened my eyes, or if my soul self was observing, but the bedroom was lit with a glorious, brilliant golden light. I knew in my heart that the same who had protected me at the hospital was nearby. As before, my eyes, it pulsated with incredible love, peace, and happiness. Suddenly, standing next to my bed was the most beautiful being, a man of average height. He wore a white robe with turquoise threads through it. Around his waist was a rope belt with 9 knots. His brown hair was shoulder length and wavy, and his face was chin. But it was his eyes that mesmerized. They were the deepest green blue, and they shone with a piercing intensity that resonated soul deep, and I knew that this being knew me on every level. He had knowledge of my past, present, and future, and no thought or action on my part could ever be hidden from him. Inventory of it. I almost didn't want to return because I was so very tired of being ill. Then I heard my grandparents' voices from the kitchen.